Hey everyone, so this week we're going to sort of plow right ahead and start working with a JavaScript framework called jQuery. Now, in last week's assignment, we were looking at doing some sort of, not really that basic, but sort of basic JavaScript work. I mean, basic mostly in the sense that we were using sort of fundamental JavaScript constructs, right? Native JavaScript constructs, like our for loop, our if-else statement. These things are things that are native to the JavaScript language. They've been around for years and years and years. And they always get the job done, and that's a really positive feature of them. Now, the thing is, however, that there are a lot of tasks that we want to perform on the web that for one reason or another just take a lot of code writing. And a lot of times the extra code that we have to write for these things isn't really very interesting. In other words, it's just because browsers work slightly differently and things like that, and they're not sort of interesting problems that as programmers, or developers that we're interested in solving, right? It's just a functional thing. They represent tasks that we have to do all the time, and we therefore want to write as little as code as possible to get them done. Now, so when we encounter this kind of thing, this is where something like this is where a framework can really help us out. So a JavaScript framework you can think of as basically a library of code that other people have written that that allows you to get some of these really basic tasks accomplished much more quickly than you would be able to do if you had to write everything yourself, right? You're collaborating with other programmers, if you want to think of it that way. And anyhow, so in order to do this, in order to take advantage of these things, we're going to look at a library called jQuery. jQuery is very commonly used in pretty much every newsroom and every web development environment at this point because it's so effective, it's so well supported. People who use it are always contributing to it and making it better, and so it's a really, really powerful library and does a lot of things that we're interested in doing. Now the trick is that if we're going to use other people's codes, we first have to find a way to get it into our page. So I just gone ahead and created a typical blank web page here, nothing we're not used to. I'm going to call this my jQuery loading test, right? That's going to be in my title tag. And we're still going to be looking mostly at the console for our output, right, to see how things are going. Don't worry, we're going to get to doing visible things very, very shortly. But in order to start working with this, we just want to take a brief moment and sort of talk about how HTML pages work. So we sort of took for granted last week that when we wanted to add some JavaScript to our page, we created these script tags. And I'm not sure how many of you were looking at this closely, but we always put these script tags inside these particular script tags that have, say, our functions and our variables in them. This is where my code goes, right? When we put them in the HTML page, and we will very shortly start separating them out into their own file, but when we put them in the HTML page, we always put them inside the body tag. So just like a person, the head and the body tag of an HTML page have separate functions. And the way that the head works, basically, and every HTML page has a head and a body tag. They are required. And so what the head tag does is the head is where we ask the page to load in all of the resources that we're interested in having available to display in our HTML body. So you can think of the body as the part of the page that we can see, right? It's where scripting happens, if we have that kind of scripting in there. But mostly it's where the structural elements of the web page exist, right? So we already have seen the H1 tag. For those of you who aren't familiar, the vast majority of elements that you see on an HTML, on a web page today are inside what's called a div, D-I-V. That tag stands for division. And I can see that if I just put a little bit of content, right, just some basic text inside a div tag under my H1, and I go ahead back to my browser window and take a look at that. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Right, so if I look at this in my browser window, I can see that, yes, in fact, I have this H1 tag, right, which is kind of an old school HTML tag. It has a bit of formatting built into it, such as the mostly the size of the text. H1 is larger text, and other text is smaller by default. We don't do much styling with things like H1 tags anymore, but they're still kind of a handy thing to have around. So everything that contains content that's going to be visible at any point on our page has to appear in this body tag. The head tag, meanwhile, if I want to use a library, for example, I have to load it first into the head tag, right? It's kind of like, if you want to recite something, you want to recite a poem by heart, right? You kind of got to get it in your head. You got to memorize it. So when we want to add a library to our HTML to our web page so that we can use it in writing our JavaScript to support our JavaScript, first we have to tell the page, hey, load this resource. Now the way that we do that is through a script tag, but it's actually going to be a script tag that is slightly different from the kind that we're used to. So as I mentioned, the library we're going to use is called jQuery. I've actually gone ahead and Googled jQuery Getting Started tutorial. This is a tutorial that I've been looking at, I sort of come back to regularly just because it's handy. And it's not linked to, for whatever reason, directly from the docs. I was looking for it the other day. So you can just go ahead and Google this and you'll come on this one. And of course, the very first thing that we need to do is we want to make sure that we set up our page properly. Now, this is under a link called Downloading jQuery. We're not actually going to technically download it the way that you would download, say, an image or a document from the internet. What we're going to do is we're going to do using jQuery with a CDN. Now, CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. And the reason that we are going to do this is because it's actually easier for the page to load. If there's any updates to the code, they happen automatically. It's a good idea to use these kinds of shared resources. This one happens to be hosted by Google, where possible, because that way if something happens or something gets out of date, you can sort of tell immediately. You don't constantly have to be re-downloading it yourself. So all I'm going to do is come here, I'm just going to copy this tag, and you can see that it's a script tag that looks basically similar to the ones that we had, right? It still has this open and close, but we have this unusual thing in the open tag, which is the source, right? And basically what this is saying to my web page is, hey, go get all the JavaScript, right? This happens to be in a folder called jQuery 1.9.0, jQuery bin.js. Go and get all that JavaScript and, keep it on hand, right? Keep it in the cache. Keep it on hand because I'm going to be using it later. Now, of course, the question is that we want to have something that we can tell our page to do. So, we're comfortable with these console log things, so we can just say, hey, here I am, right? And if we remember from console log, oops, wrong semicolon. If you remember how console log functions, right? If I open this up, I inspect an element, and I flip over to the console log, and I reload my page. There we go. No problem. So one thing we notice is that anything that we've put in these script tags is actually happening, right, as the page is loading, right? If I say console log, it's going to say right away, hey, here I am, right? By contrast, if you guys remember that when we wrote in our other assignment, our candy sorter assignment, right, when we were going through and we started to write this function, the first console log that I put in there didn't work right away. And it's because we had wrapped it in this special, function call, right? And so we had, in calling function and setting up this function, we had defined a function that we wanted to have take place, right? But we hadn't actually executed it, right? We hadn't actually told the browser, oh, by the way, do that set of instructions and here's the things to do it with. So most of our code in general is going to happen within functions. And the reason why is because very often we don't know, when we're working with a web page, right, we're loading all kinds of things into it. We're loading images, we might be loading sound files or video files, any number of things. And we don't know how long those calls, that communication to load that stuff is going to take. And so what we want to do is we want to make sure that when we go to start writing code to do something, that all the resources that we need to do it properly are loaded into the page and ready to go before we start. So I'm going to just sort of, we're just going to sort of demonstrate this, right? I'm going to write a function that says, now I'm in the function, right? And again, if we go back to our console, we should probably see, aha, the first console log gets called, but the second one doesn't, right? If I wanted to call this, right? And you see how I don't have anything inside the round parentheses here? I have to have the round parentheses because I need to tell the computer, that's one of the things that reinforces that this is a function as opposed to a variable, for example, although I realize we've talked about how they're kind of both. But that's how I tell it that this is a function. And so when I actually call that and it has no arguments, right? So in our candy sorter example, we had candy list, this array list, as an argument. In this case, we don't have any arguments because all we're doing is using console log, and that's okay. If I add that function call, then I can say, hey, now I'm in the function. Now, this is sort of an interesting thing because very often we want to make sure, as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that before we start trying to do any work on our web page, for example, making a button clickable, or maybe adding an image or moving something, we need to make sure that everything on the page has sort of settled into place, right? That all of the phone calls to all the servers around the web have been made. All of the results have come in, right? Kind of like voting. All the results have come in, and now we're ready to start working with the results. And to do this, to make sure to kind of make sure that that's true, the browser provides a sort of a little flag that basically says it tells the browser, or rather the browser tells the program that, hey, everything is loaded. I've got all the stuff you asked for. It's here, I'm ready to go, let's get down to business. And the function that this, the event, this flag, often called an event, and we're going to talk about event listeners a little bit more in class on Thursday. This event is called document ready or document loaded. And we can use direct raw JavaScript to write this document loaded function. But for a variety of reasons that you guys are going to see, we're going to start using jQuery for this because jQuery lets us write this much faster and much more quickly, and much more concisely than doing this with just raw. So where am I going to get this function? Where am I going to find out what it looks like? This is where documentation becomes a really big feature of working in any kind of scripting language, working on the web in general, right? So we were already here. This is where we found the code that lets us load our jQuery onto our page. And now if we sort of scroll down, so here was the setup, and now this is hello jQuery. That's a very common thing we say hello world. But we're actually going to use, we're going to look at this document ready function. And so this is a shorthand, right? This is weird, right? The $sign thing, we haven't seen this before. What this $sign is it's a shorthand, and it's basically that shorthand is telling the computer that this function called ready, right? We see how it's like a similar syntax, right? We see this dot syntax. So when we were measuring the length of our array, it was dot length. So what we're saying is, hey, look at the jQuery, go to that jQuery library, look for this function called document ready. And when the document is ready, right, when you get this flag, when the browser sends up this flag, I want you to call this function, right? Whatever function it is that's in those round parentheses. So in this case, it's my write to console function. It's a very simple function, doesn't really do much, right? It just says, hey, now I'm in the function. And maybe I'll just say, hey, now my document is ready. Okay? So if all goes according to plan, then what will have happened on this page is we'll have loaded this jQuery. This function will be processed, and once this document ready flag goes up, once everything has been loaded, then the write to console function will be called, and we'll see this now my document is ready call in the console. So let's see what we get. Oh, great. Well, that was pretty fast. Now, not too surprising because we weren't really loading much from very far, right? Actually, all of this data was in here. But what we're going to see in the coming weeks is how When we want to, say, load data remotely, load CSS remotely, this is going to be a really handy feature for making sure that we can keep everything together.